Welcome back, guys, and today we are checking out another SCP video. Except today, instead of checking out a specific SCP, we're going to check out some of the groups of interest in the SCP universe. I decided to go ahead and start with the Global Occult Coalition because they seem to be the most prolific outside of the SCP Foundation itself. I hear about them a lot, so let's go ahead and learn about what they are.
The Global Occult Coalition, better known as the GOC, are a group of bloodthirsty, gun-toting cowboys who shoot first and ask questions later. Whether it's a helpful sentient chair or a little girl whose only anomalous quality is manifesting flowers and ice cream, the GOC have only one response: destroy, burn it, crush it, shoot it in the face with extreme prejudice, and be home in time for dinner. Or at least that's what plenty of SCP Foundation devotees would have you believe. But if we only
Okay.
judged an organization by the words of its greatest opponents, we'd be dealing with an extremely one-sided picture. Are they gun-ho morons who regularly blunder into complex situations and make everything worse with either plain ignorance or outright malice? Or are they humanity's true defenders, working on behalf of the world's democratically elected leaders rather than the uncountable mystery of the Foundation? As with most things in life, the answer is often found somewhere in the middle. That's why today, we're going to take a closer look at the United Nations' answer to the anomalous threats that inhabit our world. Who are they? What do they believe? And what are some of their greatest victories and failures? The inception of what we now know as the Global Occult Coalition began during the Seventh Occult War, which occurred during World War II. The Nazi SS Achnerbe and the Titelgesellschaft attempted to complete a
Always the Nazis, isn't it? You can always trace it back to the Nazis and their sneaky little BS that they were always doing, huh?
ritual known as the Rite of Solomon, which would have given them terrifying supernatural power. This was the first time that a number of world governments understood the true scope of the paranormal threat out there, and after the war concluded, with many dead, they wanted to make sure this could never happen again. Of course, the SCP Foundation works in cooperation with all world governments, but ultimately they still have autonomy, and no one nation could ever shoulder the responsibility of protecting all of humanity either, lest nationalism and self-interest get in the way of the mission.
Right.
The United Nations needed their own organization that was completely accountable to them and them alone in order to protect themselves from paranormal threats, or parathreats, and thus the Global Occult Coalition was born. As the coalition part of the name suggests, the GOC is an umbrella term for 108 different paranormal organizations, all gathered under the shared goal of protecting humanity from parathreats and fostering continued positive relationships between
Okay, so the GOC isn't like a rebel group. If anything, it seems like the GOC is probably the most government sanctioned group so far. If they are a direct arm of the United Nations and have members from all the United Nations members, I mean, so the GOC is a UN, like an anomalous. I don't want to say anomalous containment because it seems like they don't contain stuff; they just destroy it. So it seems like the GOC is the UN's version of the SCP Foundation, except they don't secure and contain anomalies, they just destroy them, which is interesting. But that brings up the question, okay, so the SCP Foundation is basically a privately owned company, you could say. Um, and I guess the O5 members would be like what, their board of directors who kind of control everything, while the GOC is an actual government sanctioned, uh, or I should say UN sanctioned, like, task force. Interesting. Okay. All right. So that gives me a little bit better of an idea. So the GOC is more governmental based, while the SCP Foundation is like private industry essentially.
Paranormal groups. Its member groups include, but are in no way limited to, the Bavarian Illuminati, the International Center for the Study of
Okay.
Unified Thaumatology, the Reformed Holy Order of the Knights Templar, Servants of the Silicon Nornir, the United Church of Satan Science Division, the World Para-Health Organization, and the Universalist Order of the Airseer. Yeah, it's a lot to take in, but don't worry, there
Hmm.
won't be a quiz later.
Man, the GOC is almost like a catch-all organization for any group that's like, hey, if you've got any information about paranormal activity, anomalous artifacts, or anything like that, take them to your local, whatever it is, your Bavarian Illuminati, and then they will share it with us as a whole, the GOC, and then we can do something about it. Okay. Interesting structure.
These groups and many more unite under the Global Occult Coalition's five-fold mission. Understanding these 5 missions is vital to understanding why the GOC works in the way it does, and why it differs from the Foundation. Mission 1, Survival. This is the primary directive of the GOC, ensuring the survival of humanity in the face of parathreats. Mission 2, Concealment. Much like the Foundation, the GOC seeks to conceal knowledge of parathreats from the public that could cause mass panic or loss of life. Mission 3, Protection. In an interesting departure from the somewhat colder Foundation perspective, the GOC also prizes the safety of individual humans, including its own personnel. Mission 4, Destruction.
Okay, so that probably means the GOC doesn't do things like have D-class personnel. Um, which I guess makes sense seeing how they're not containing SCPs, they're not testing them, or anything like that. If their goal is just to mission 4, destruction, if it's to destroy them, then they really don't need D-class personnels. Okay, which I guess would mean okay, well, let's keep going.
This mission is perhaps the biggest difference between the GOC and the Foundation, and is often what defines them in the public eye. The GOC considers the very existence of parathreats to be a danger to the survival of humanity, so no risks are taken to ensure their survival. And finally, Mission 5, Education. The GOC seeks to expand their knowledge base in regards to the parathreats they face across the globe. Clearly, the Global Occult Coalition knows where they stand. Many have positioned the GOC as villains to the Foundation's more level-headed approach, but arguments could also be made in the GOC's favor when it comes to killing off rather than studying anomalies. The number of deaths caused in containment breaches of parathreats that could have been executed immediately after being captured is one persuasive argument, as is the continued potential threat of parathreats currently sitting in containment. And while the GOC has been called inhumane for its desire to murder parathreats, ask any member of D-Class personnel whether the SCP.
See, it's exactly what I was about to bring up. Was I was going to say, well, I suppose you could say that that makes them more ethical than the SCP Foundation because they don't use D-class personnel. But I stopped myself because the flip side of that coin is, what is the ethics of killing some of these SCPs? I mean, you know, we saw some of them are first off, some of them are inanimate objects. So even if it does have anomalous effects, a lot of them are still basically tools that a person has to use in order for them to do something. So like the butler's handbell, right? It was like one of the first ones I did. But that's an inanimate object. It's non-sentient, so you could argue you could destroy it and have no ethical qualms about it. But at the same time, the handbell itself isn't really an ethical conundrum. It's an inanimate object. The person using it is going to be what results in the ethical or unethical use of that SCP. So And then, so that's a kind of a gray area, but then you get to the part where you have conscious, living, sentient SCPs, some of which are non-hostile. Uh, we did the video about the Not Another Murder Monster, and that creature turned out to be essentially misunderstood. While it looks terrifying and its physical features are terrifying, it's basically just like a child that wants to learn. It's frankly, once you learn how to interact with it, it's non-hostile. And then you've got things like the tickle monster, which are outright benevolent creatures, very positive influences on the world around them. What is the ethics of killing the tickle monster? I mean, so, on one hand, you could say the GOC is more ethical because they don't use D-class personnel as cannon fodder. And on the other hand, you could say that, they're not very ethical because they still willingly destroy sentient beings.
Foundation is a more ethical organization in comparison. While the Foundation are generally far more considerate with anomalies than the GOC, their attitude towards their human cannon fodder is just as cold.
Yeah.
Of course, we're not saying either organization is right or wrong in this instance. More that it's a nuanced issue that's difficult to look at in terms of morality. Later, we'll take a look at two of the most famous case studies to see how the GOC's methodology
Yeah, they're almost two sides of the same coin, and there's blood on both sides of that coin, so
plays out on the field. But first, let's take a look at how the actual organization is structured. At the top of the tower is the Council of the 108. Much like the United Nations, this council is made up of representatives from each of the 108 member organizations of the GOC. Below that is the High Command, headed by the mysterious Undersecretary General D.C. Alfine, believed to be a woman.
So, if you have the Council of 108 at the top, then that means at the top of your hierarchy, there's 108 people that need to come to at least a majority vote on something. Man, seems like 108 council members. Man, that seems like a lot of red tape, you know? Like the O5 council's much smaller, which means they can probably come to a consensus much more often and much quicker, which means they can do things. They can probably respond to things faster than the GOC can, based solely on their decision-making process.
Who is living somewhere in Europe, as well as the Nexus. The Nexus directs a network of command central hubs to coordinate and support local operations. Below that, the GOC is separated into three prongs: the Physics Division, the Psyche Division, and the Ptolemy Division. The Physics Division...
Man, the GOC would also have to be, as far as manpower is concerned, would have to be way bigger than the SCP as well. And if they're getting funding from 108 separate countries, they should be better funded than the SCP Foundation as well. Like, now that I'm thinking about this, because if the SCP Foundation is a secret organization that keeps even their existence is a secret to the general population, and the GOC's existence is not, right? Because the general population knows about the GOC, right? Since it's the United Nations thing.
Division is the action arm of the GOC, made up of assessment teams and strike teams. It's their job to investigate and capture or neutralize parathreats. The Psyche Division is the diplomatic sector of the GOC and consists of special observers and ambassadors. These personnel maintain relationships between paranormal groups and keeps things smooth between normal humanity and the occult. The Ptolemy Division is known as the support arm and is home to the quartermasters and the research and development department. This division helps the other two divisions do their work, from managing logistics and resource distribution to developing state-of-the-art weapons and equipment for GOC personnel. One more quick note before we move on to two of the GOC's greatest hits. It's important to know that the GOC classifies anomalies different to how the SCP Foundation does. Rather than SCPs,
Makes sense.
the GOC refers to them as TEs, or threat entities. While the GOC employs a frankly baffling number of code words for various groups, ideas, or concepts that we don't have the time to get into right now, we can tell you that
Yeah, I think it's just a matter of the size of the GOC, you know. It just has to be so much larger that, they probably have, you know, employee handbooks on top of guidebooks on top of, like, there's got to be so much, like, regulation and red tape that goes with the GOC. Like, that's probably why they don't seem to be as effective as the Foundation. While the Foundation is probably smaller, because it's like a privately run business with a smaller group of decision makers, they're probably more effective and efficient at what they do than something like the GOC. The GOC seems like it's so massive. It would have to be so massive, and with such a large command structure, with, man, even at its highest level, you're talking about 108 people that have to come to a decision. I mean, it seems like the main difference here is the GOC is larger, better staffed, has more manpower and more funding, but their sheer size is what weighs them down and slows them down. They probably are much slower in the decision making processes. So I would bet that if the GOC and the Foundation learned about an anomalous entity at the same time, I would bet the Foundation gets to it first, just based solely on the fact that they're probably more streamlined in how they function than the GOC. The GOC seems like a big lumbering hulk of an organization that just has a lot of moving parts and a lot of people that have decisions that need to be made. A lot of people that have to check with their bosses, that have to check with their bosses, that have to check with their bosses. So the GOC probably just moves slower. And that's probably also why they focus on just one thing, and that's destroying, you know, yeah. Yeah. It's probably just why they focus on just destroying anomalies rather than containing them, just because they seem like, you know, they're they're a big fat broadsword and the Foundation is a scalpel. Is what it seems like.
the main types of TEs. There are KTEs, or known threat entities, UTE, or unknown threat entities, PTEs, potential threat entities, and LTEs, or liquidated threat entities.
I'm just seeing that scene from the Boondocks with with the two guys doing the I think it's like the Pulp Fiction line or something. I don't know, but there's known entities and unknown entities and known knowns and unknown knowns and known unknowns.
Entities, which are threat entities they have confirmed to be destroyed. Now you should have a pretty good idea of who the Global Occult Coalition is, their member organizations, their mission statements, their major ideological differences from the SCP Foundation. But it's a common truism that actions speak louder than words. So we need to talk about two of the most infamous incidents in the organization's history. First,
let's see what they did.
There's the chair. Known as KTE 0937 Velveteen, or 6th Chair to the Global Occult Coalition, and SCP-1609 to the SCP Foundation. This is an incident that the Foundation and Foundation supporters love to cite when criticizing the GOC. From their telling, 1609 was an innocent, if a little spooky-looking chair with a harmless, anomalous property. It teleports behind people who want to sit down. In spite of how helpful and benign this is, the Global Occult Coalition did what they always do, and decided to neutralize it by forcing it into a wood chipper. However, this didn't actually kill the chair. It merely transformed it into a collection of sentient wood chips with an understandable chip on its shoulder. Now, when angered, typically by mentions of things related to the GOC or by the sound of motors running, these chips teleport into people's lungs, causing fatal organ damage. Surely this shows that the GOC are a bunch of haphazard idiots. They transformed a harmless anomaly into a killer. Well, it's not that simple.
Well, I mean, sounds like they didn't think it through all the way.
According to their own telling of the incident with the sixth chair, it was exactly that. Just the sixth and a number of other parathreats being destroyed because of their relation to a dangerous parathreat creator known as the Carpenter. All 5 other items were successfully incinerated. The chair was only unsuccessfully neutralized with the wood chipper due to a machine error with the incinerator. In other
Okay, I guess incineration would be smarter.
words, what is often painted as a prime example of GOC brashness and incompetence could just as easily have been a total accident that occurred during an otherwise logical action. No different from the fatalities that often occur during an SCP Foundation containment breach. But let's
A lot of
look
people
at
die
another
during the
example.
breaches.
SCP-1522, known to the GOC as LTE-4201 Velveteen, or the Ghost Ships. The Foundation often cites this as being another textbook example of the GOC taking things too far, and murdering a completely innocent anomaly minding its own business. This anomaly was 2 apparently sapient boats in the middle of the ocean that showed compassion for one another, giving them the reputation of being literal love boats. The GOC apparently objected to this union and blew one of the boats to Kingdom.
Oh, so they have like, yeah, see, they have like military grade like strike naval cruisers. Like that's heavy government funding to have something like that.
Come, leaving the other to self-terminate in grief. How can the GOC possibly come out as anything but monsters in this scenario, harming 2 wholesome anomalies that would never hurt a fly? Well, don't be so sure about that. From the GOC report, we can first see that the boats were already encroaching into human territory, leading to reports of ghost ships from fishermen trawling in that area. And while the GOC did admittedly fire the first shot, it cannot be denied that the surviving ship's retaliation was equally, if not more violent than the initial attack. Upon attacking the first of the 2 ships, the second willfully collided with the GOC vessel, manned by the strike team Ocean Thunder, at hypersonic speeds. This killed the entire GOC team present. While it's easy to say that this attack was in self-defense, it also shows that the boats always had devastating combat potential if provoked. If the parathreat had performed this same act on a larger Navy ship, or on a cruise ship or any kind of commercial vessel, hundreds of lives would be lost.
It's true. Hmm. Yeah, that's a hard one. I don't know. I mean, that's that thing though. Like the whole first strike, preemptive strike type deal. I mean, you know, that's a tough one. I mean, you could argue in both directions. Like the GOC, you know, you could say that the potential was there for catastrophic loss of life to innocent people. But on the flip side, you can make the argument, well, the only reason they retaliated was because it was a retaliation. You attack them, they attacked back. So, you know, it's a tough argument, and we see those kind of arguments in real life. So,
Doesn't seem so innocent now, does it? What conclusion can we draw from all this? Is the Global Occult Coalition a gaggle of bloodthirsty idiots looking to kill off anomalies for the sake of it? No. Are they a morally perfect organization, protecting human survival and the quality of human life from a foundation that couldn't care less? The answer is no here too. While the SCP Foundation and the GOC have been known to squabble, and have caused even more damage to one another in alternate realities, they're ultimately 2 sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
The 2 have even been known to reluctantly collaborate when necessary. Perhaps they don't always see eye to eye.
they are very similar, man. It's almost like, you know, having a private company and a government company that do the same thing.
Especially on some of the smaller and more contentious anomalies. But in a world where cosmic nightmares are lurking just behind the fabric of our reality, and some are preparing to strike, it feels comforting to have both of them at the ready. Now go check out our playlist on the epic saga.
Oh, Oh man, okay. So that was the Global Occult Coalition. Uh Pretty good breakdown. Gave me a much better understanding of who they are and what they do and their relationship to the SCP Foundation. Um yeah, interesting. Definitely two sides of the same coin. They definitely come at a situation differently, and they have different end results that they want to achieve. But, um it's pretty neat overall. Yeah, man. It seems like the GOC is like, the larger technically, at least in my eyes, they're the more legitimate group out of the two, since they have um, government backing, government funding. Obviously all the governments involved with the GOC know about who they are and what they do. And while they do try and keep anomalies themselves secret from the public, like the SCP Foundation, they don't seem to keep their own existence a secret from the general public. At least it didn't seem like that. It didn't seem like they kept the existence of the GOC a secret. Maybe what they do and how they do it is a secret, but I mean, they're an arm of the United Nations, so it's couldn't possibly be a secret. Anyways, I liked the video. I hope you liked the video. If you did, like and subscribe. As always, leave a comment down below. Doesn't always have to be SCP stuff, but if this is what you're here for, then let me know. What is your favorite SCP? What are the ones you want me to check out after we get through some of these groups of interests? Let me know down in the comments. And until next time, guys, as always, take care of yourselves. Have a great day.